Now you might be asking yourself, are there even 10 Robin Hood movies in existence? Yes. And there are more. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Cobwebs channel, where we are dusting off old movies. My name is Daniel, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my top 10 movies starring the legendary character of Robin Hood. Now, Robin Hood is undoubtedly one of my favorite fictional characters of all time. Now, how much is he a fictional character and how much is he a historical figure? Scholars have been debating that, and there's no real consensus, and that's not what this video is about. This video is about Robin Hood as the star of movies. Robin Hood movies date back over 100 years, and this character has endured for far longer than that throughout a lot of other kinds of pop culture. And why do I love him so much? Why has he endured so much? Well, for one thing, I just love medieval stories, and I love stories with knights and kings and queens and swords and shields and bow and arrows. I love all that kind of iconography, but Robin Hood is the best of those kind of stories, I think, because it's all about common people versus those in power. The power structure in medieval times was definitely not ideal, and something that I love so much about Robin Hood is it's about those peasants rising up to claim their human rights, all led by a disgraced knight or nobleman who turns outlaw to help them out. He sees that some people are hoarding so much of the wealth and power in his community, and he steals from them, gives it to those less fortunate, those who are starving to death, really. And not only just to help those people out of altruism, but also to, in most versions of the story, put the rightful king, the king that he is loyal to, Richard the Lionheart, back on the throne. That's something that I love about Robin Hood, is he's not about claiming power for himself. He's all about just being the guy who can help people out because there's no one else to do it, but eventually getting the rightful king back on the thrones for him to lead and help them instead of himself. It's just such a classic story. It's really the template for Star Wars, if you think about it. It's all the rebellion versus the evil empire, just on a smaller scale, and all focused on this one guy who really makes this whole revolution, if that's what you want to call it, happen. So without further ado, let's talk about my top 10 movies starring this legendary character. And at number 10, in last place, is the only movie on here that's really here by default, and that is Mel Brooks' send-up of the story, Robin Hood Men in Tights from 1993. Now, hold on, I know what you're thinking. I know a lot of people love this movie, and it had to be on the list somewhere, but comedy is a very subjective thing, and the thing with me in this movie is I just don't find it that funny. So many of the jokes are very focused on just, what if this trendy 90s thing was in medieval times? It's not that clever to me. A lot of the humor I find pretty dumb. But the biggest problem with the movie for me is I don't think Cary Elwes is a good Robin Hood. He's very insincere. He knows it's all a joke, and he's just treating it all as a silly joke. And I actually think, even for a comedy, I think the better way to do this movie was have a good, sincere Robin Hood at the center and have a lot of goofy characters and silly situations around him. And in some ways, it feels like that's kind of what they're going for, but Cary Elwes just doesn't sell it. He just knows it's a joke and he treats it like one. And that's a shame because Cary Elwes is one of the most legendary swashbucklers in movies as Wesley in The Princess Bride. So he could have been great. I just don't think this movie hits it. The legendary staff fight between Robin and Little John is actually really funny in the way that their sticks keep shrinking down smaller and smaller. That's a good joke for me. And I really like Roger Rees as the sheriff of Rottingham. He's my favorite cast member in the movie because I think he does what no one else in this movie is able to do, and that's be funny and silly, but be convincing and exist within the reality of this story. I think he pulls that off much better than Cary Elwes does. So shout out to Roger Rees as the sheriff of Rottingham, but this movie still falls at last place. At number 9, we've got Hammer's attempt at the Robin Hood story, and that is Sword of Sherwood Forest from 1960. This is very much the classic take on Robin Hood. It kicks off with Richard Green as Robin Hood, who also played the character in a TV show around this time, skips any kind of origin story style stuff, and just starts with him as the leader of these merry men and an outlaw. It's about the sheriff of Nottingham, played by Peter Cushing in this case, trying to overthrow the king's chancellor and get power for himself. Now, the reason that this one is low is it has all the pieces for a great Robin Hood movie, and I just don't think it ever rises above being okay. Richard Green is definitely a very serviceable Robin Hood who doesn't really have the swashbuckling charm or just heroic persona that the story should have. I also think this is the weakest Maid Marion of any of the movies we're going to talk about today. She is basically grouchy and rude through most all of the movie. She couldn't possibly have less chemistry with Richard Green, so none of the romance stuff works at all. I do enjoy Peter Cushing as the Sheriff of Nottingham because he's one of my favorite actors of all time. He plays it very low key, and I wish that he could have had a bit more flair to his performance, and unfortunately he gets taken out before the final battle of the movie. So this movie is definitely okay, but never rises above that. At number 8 is Robin Hood from 1991, directed by John Irvin. This is a British version of the story that was coming out kind of in competition with a much bigger Robin Hood movie that came out in 1991, but couldn't hack it with the competition, came out in theatrical release in some places overseas, but premiered on television, at least over here in the US. I've heard some people talk about this movie and say it is the superior Robin Hood movie that came out in 1991. I have no idea what they're talking about. To me, the movie is perfectly fine, but also never quite rises above okay. It's a very dark and dreary looking Robin Hood movie, and it never escapes looking like a TV movie. Even if it wasn't originally intended to be a TV movie, it looks and feels like one when it comes to the cinematography, the colors, and the score. So it never escapes feeling small. Patrick Bergin is a serviceable Robin Hood. He definitely has some charm, he has the looks, but he's just not terribly memorable. Probably the most memorable thing about the movie is Uma Thurman as Maid Marion. Her relationship with Robin Hood and their romance is definitely the biggest part of the movie and the biggest focus. It overall works fine enough. I think this movie is perfectly serviceable. It is a decent time watching the Robin Hood story, and it just never also rises above being kind of forgettable. At number 7 is the first Disney version of the story that's going to pop up on this list, but definitely not the last. This is the story of Robin Hood and his merry men from 1952. Now, this version opens up with an origin story of Robin and Marion as teenagers starting to fall in love until Robin's father is murdered for defying Prince John, and then Robin goes off into the Sherwood forest, becomes an outlaw. This live-action Disney film is directed by Ken Anakin, who made a lot of the classic Disney movies, including Swiss Family Robinson. Richard Todd plays Robin Hood, and he's very young, and he never quite escapes feeling like a teenager. He feels a bit too young to really lead these merry men in a convincing way. He's fine, but definitely would never be called one of my favorite Robin Hoods. However, I think this might be the only Robin Hood movie, the only one on this list, where Maid Marian might actually be the best part of the movie. Joan Rice plays Marion, and she has great chemistry with Robin, and I actually think their romance is one of the better things about the movie. There's a scene where he has to carry her across a river, and just him carrying her feels a lot like a love scene, plays very romantically, and I think it's very effective. The movie sells the politics of the story very well in terms of the common people rising up against those in power, and the Queen is actually present in this version of the story, which causes Prince John to have to sneak around quite a bit more, and that added dynamic of tension I thought worked very well for the movie. The third act is a bit disappointing. It's missing a climactic sword fight, and the Sheriff of Nottingham is defeated kind of by accident. The movie is definitely not one of the best stories of Robin Hood, but it is bright, colorful, and fun. Alan Adale takes us through the story with minstrel songs that sound very authentic to that kind of music, and I really enjoyed that. Definitely a solid and fun Robin Hood movie. Okay, my number 6 is going to be the most controversial thing about this list, so stay with me. Staying with Disney, my number 6 is Disney's Robin Hood from 1973. Now, I know this movie is incredibly important to so many people's childhoods, and I definitely watched it as a kid too, but the fact is, watching it as an adult, I can never escape the feeling that I am watching a children's movie. It doesn't quite work for me as an adult like some of the other Disney movies that I love so much, like Beauty and the Beast or Pinocchio or something like that. To watch this version of Robin Hood, you're going to have to watch a lot of kids run around pretending to be Robin Hood and playing. You're going to have to watch Prince John suck his thumb and yell mommy. There's definitely a lot of childish stuff. Vignette structure of it definitely makes it lack a propulsive story and an adventurous intensity. However, the movie is a lot of fun. The animation, scratchy as it is very raw and fun and great to look at. I think the animation is beautiful. I love the voice cast. I think it's probably got one of the best voice casts of all of the Disney animated movies. I know a lot of people have huge crushes on Fox Robin Hood. That's apparently a big thing on the internet, so shout out to you people. I'm glad you are able to enjoy it that way. They actually do a fantastic job with making Robin and Marion convincing romantic leads and making that romance feel like it matters. They also do a very good job of making the tax collecting feel like pretty barbaric oppression and using that in place of actual violence because, again, this is a children's film. I enjoyed this as a kid, but even as a kid, there was another Robin Hood movie, which is going to place higher up on this list, that I was much more into. So this was never like my Robin Hood. It was never the most important Robin Hood to me. It's just a fun little Disney animated children's film. And that's about as far as my enjoyment goes with it. And that's why it's only placing number 6, even though I know so many of you love it. I know people adore it. I get it. I respect that. Just couldn't quite crack my top 5. Now we hit the top 5 with my number 5, and that is Ridley Scott's Robin Hood from 2010. Now, this is a movie that I actually started watching as a teenager long ago and couldn't even get through it, turned it off because it was just so dark and dreary and not what I wanted out of a Robin Hood movie. Coming back to it in preparation to make this list, I had watched a lot of Robin Hood movies before I got to this one. So I definitely didn't go into this wanting and expecting more of the same thing. I wasn't like, oh, please give me a Robin Hood movie that's exactly like the 6 that I just watched. No, instead, I was happy to get something very different. This is not a swashbuckler. It's almost nothing like any other Robin Hood movie. What it is a historical war movie made by a great director, Ridley Scott, starring Russell Crowe and Cate Blanchett, who are both, by the way, leading a cast that was impressive in 2010, but I think is actually even more impressive now. This cast includes Oscar Isaac, Lea Seydoux, William Hurt, Max von Sydow, Mark Strong. It's an incredible cast, but like I said, it's not a swashbuckler. It has much more in common with Gladiator and Braveheart than any kind of other Robin Hood movie. I really like the relationship between Robin and Marion, Russell Crowe and Cate Blanchett. It's got this whole false identity angle to it where Robin is Robin Longstride, and he, by the request of the dead Robert of Locksley in this, goes to report of his death to his father and his wife. And Lord Locksley, Max von Sydow, creates this whole scheme to get Robin Longstride to pretend to be Robert of Locksley so that they can keep their land. And so it's got this whole false identity angle to it. It's got Cate Blanchett and Russell Crowe having to pretend to be man and wife. And I never would have thought that Russell Crowe and Cate Blanchett would be cute, but they're cute. There's only a little bit of steal from the rich, give to the poor stuff in this movie. I wish there was more, but when it's there, it's really, really good. But for some reason, it ends up becoming about the English having to fight the French. And it becomes about Mark Strong being this traitor, and Robin has to join alongside Prince John to fight against the French. I don't know why they went that direction for Robin Hood's story, but it's a pretty good war movie. Oscar Isaac is really good as a sniveling, gross, awful Prince John. He's excellent. And by the end of the movie, it ends up ending with the status quo of Robin Hood. That's kind of where he ends up, is where most Robin Hood movies would begin. I really wish we got a sequel, but I know this isn't the kind of movie that normally gets sequels. There's no Braveheart 2, Braveheart's Revenge, or anything like that. But I would have loved to have seen this Robin Hood in the traditional story. It's something we never got, but I appreciate that we got this. All right, possibly more controversial than my placement of the Disney animated Robin Hood movie is my number 4, and that is Princess of Thieves. From 2001, another Disney movie, actually, that is starring Keira Knightley as Gwen, Robin Hood's daughter. Now, I went into this movie with a lot of skepticism because it is actually a TV movie and it only has Robin Hood as an old man and focuses in on his daughter. The reason this movie is as high as it is because it is really fun. It is a total blast of a swashbuckler with a great energy, a really fun lead with Keira Knightley. And despite the fact that Robin is not technically the main character or the leader of the movie, it plays like a great classic Robin Hood movie. I thought Keira Knightley was a really good sort of replacement for where the Robin Hood archetype would normally be. And most of the movie is her teaming up with Prince Philip, who is Richard the Lionheart's illegitimate son who was long living in France. And it's about Gwen and Philip as a team going off on this adventure. They're a great team. They're really, really fun in the movie, and I thought their romance was terrific. Romance is very important to swashbucklers. That's why I keep bringing it up. It's very important that that aspect of the movie works. Really, really works in this movie. This has a great supporting cast with my second favorite Sheriff of Nottingham of all time, Malcolm McDowell as the Sheriff of Nottingham. He's great. You know Malcolm McDowell is always going to bring it as a villain. I love him as the Sheriff of Nottingham. It's got Stuart Wilson as an aging Robin Hood, who was actually the main villain in the Mask of Zorro. You might know him from that other swashbuckler movie. It is a really fun swashbuckling adventure. Now, sure, some of the action isn't great. It's a TV movie. Not all of the costuming is entirely realistic, but for the most part, I really like the look of Sherwood Forest. It's always satisfying to see our Robin Hood character, in this case Gwen, split an arrow. There's some really good bow play in this movie, some good sword fights. This movie's just super fun, and I'm guessing most people watching this video have never watched it, but if you like swashbucklers, if you like medieval movies and Robin Hood movies, I recommend Princess of Thieves. I think it's really good. Now, my number 3 is the number 3 for a good reason, and it's because other than my top 2, I think it's the only movie on this list that I would call a great movie, and that is Robin and Marion from 1976. This film stars Sean Connery as Robin Hood and Audrey Hepburn as Marion, and it's about Robin and Marion who have now aged, they've grown old. In this version of the story, Robin has been fighting with King Richard in the Crusades for decades. And he lived the whole Robin Hood life when he was young, but not as dramatically as the legends make it out to be. He's not quite that legendary character. But he's been fighting with Richard in the Crusades for many years. He finally comes back to the woman who was his wife, Marion, who has now become a nun. And the movie is a very interesting and kind of deep movie about aging and regret and how do you move on and how do you find love late in your life. It's about Robin and Marion reconciling their relationship. Sean Connery is a great Robin Hood, and this movie is actually more of a swashbuckling adventure movie than I expected. It's got some great action scenes. It's got some swashbuckling adventure. It's about Robin kind of becoming the legendary character that the legends made him out to be, that he never quite was earlier in life. Now, he's still very flawed. Something that I love about Robin Hood is I love that he's typically not flawed. I love that he is a perfectly altruistic character who always fights for what's right. I think that's the way Robin Hood should be. But this is an example of a more flawed Robin Hood who has a bit too much pride and a lust for adventure that becomes kind of his downfall. And I think it really works in this case because Sean Connery is a great actor and he's able to portray those flaws while still being very likable and very heroic. I love Audrey Hepburn as Marion. Their scenes together have a lot of gravitas. They're so good. Now, Robert Shaw plays the Sheriff of Nottingham, the main villain of the movie. One of the more boring Sheriff of Nottinghams. He's not great, but the movie has a great supporting cast besides them, including Richard Harris and Ian Holm. There's a lot of great actors in this movie. I highly recommend this movie. It's a great movie about aging, but it's also very honest about how horrific kings can be and the whole power structure of medieval times. It's very honest about how brutal the Crusades were, and that takes a great toll on Robin Hood. It has great action that's very messy and violent and not pretty and swashbucklery in any way, which is something I appreciated. And despite the fact that it's a Robin Hood movie, it's unpredictable and has a real gut punch of an ending. So I think this is a terrific, beautiful movie that I think everybody should check out if they haven't yet. At number 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time, as both these top 2 are, and that is Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, starring Kevin Costner. Now let me address the elephant in the room right off the bat. Now this movie is often laughed at because Kevin Costner is so American and he's playing this British folk hero and he doesn't have a British accent. I don't know why this is the only Robin Hood movie where people care about accents. Go back and watch the Disney movie everybody loves. Go back and watch the 1938 classic that everybody loves. Not everybody in those movies has a British accent. And Errol Flynn is not British, okay? I don't know why everybody cares about it in this movie and not in other ones. I think Kevin Costner is a great Robin Hood because what matters much more than a British accent is the power of a great movie star and that level of charisma that is not easy to find. And Kevin Costner absolutely has it. Look at Cary Elwes as Robin Hood, a great British accent. He doesn't have any of that gravitas that Kevin Costner does. I love him in this movie so much because I believe Robin Hood should be the best of us. He should be an incredibly altruistic character who always fights for what's right, no matter what it costs him. And Kevin Costner embodies that so well. When he stands up on the giant tree in Sherwood Forest and gives a speech about how they should fight back, about how he will lead them, about how the forest will provide them everything they need, I believe him. Like, I want to follow that dude. Like, that is an awesome hero right there. I just love Costner in this role. It is an incredible supporting cast, including Alan Rickman as the best Sheriff of Nottingham ever. This is peak Sheriff of Nottingham. He's just eating up the scenery in every scene he's in. It's so much fun. And I love the sword fight between them at the end. It's so messy and violent in such a great way. Now, the romance between Robin and Marion is perfect in this movie. I think it's great. A scene where he says, will you do it for your king? And she says, no, I'll do it for you. I think that's such a beautiful romantic moment, one of the peak Robin Hood moments of all time. And the score by Michael Kamen is incredible. It's one of the best scores of the entire 1990s. The action is awesome. I love the inclusion of Morgan Freeman as Azim. His relationship with Robin is really great, but also that Morgan Freeman's character is always bringing in some kind of new invention, including gunpowder. It allows you to get some explosions in the movie. Love this movie. But when I set out to make this list, there was no question of what number one would be, and that is The Adventures of Robin Hood from 1938, directed by Michael Curtiz. First of all, I'll say up front, this is the Robin Hood movie I have the most nostalgia for. I said that when I was a kid, that animated Robin Hood movie was not my go-to Robin Hood, because this was. I grew up loving this movie. I've loved it ever since. But I do think on a technical level, this is the best of the Robin Hood movies. If you want the classic story of Robin Hood, this is the one movie on the list that's going to give you everything you want. It sets the template for what a Robin Hood story should be. It has the archery contest. It has saving Robin Hood from the gallows. It has rescuing Maid Marian from the castle. Prince John trying to usurp the throne. Robin Hood and Little John fighting with staffs on the log. Robin Hood sword fighting Friar Tuck. It has all those classic set pieces, those iconic sequences that you want out of the story. It's one of the most beautiful looking movies of all time. The Technicolor is so bright and vivid. It's so lush with colors, with incredible costuming. It looks like the most expensive movie on this list. The amount of extras is staggering. They had so many people involved with making this giant production. Robin Hood's costume is awesome, but everyone else's too. Special shout out to Guy of Gisborne. Basil Rathbone is Guy of Gisborne, the main villain of this movie. I think his costume is awesome, and if you got Basil Rathbone as your villain, you know you've got a good movie. The Sheriff of Nottingham is definitely kind of a joke in this movie. This is all about Claude Rains as Prince John and Basil Rathbone as Guy of Gisborne. Truly great villains. Now, Errol Flynn as Robin Hood, he is the Robin Hood. Almost nobody owns a character as much as Errol Flynn owns Robin Hood, and just off the power of one movie. He embodies the character perfectly, but he definitely starts the movie and ends the movie in the same place. He's always that great altruistic hero who fights for what's right. So he doesn't have a character arc in the movie, which is why I think the emotional power of the movie actually comes from Olivia de Havilland as Maid Marian. She's the best Maid Marian by far. She has a clear character arc, starting out on the side of the Normans, of the bad guys. She learns to fight for what's right, not necessarily because she falls in love with Robin Hood, but because he shows her the injustice. He shows her without filter what it is that the Normans are actually doing to the people of England. And she's converted, and she has a true character arc where she starts in a bad place, ends in a good place, fights for what's right. I think her character arc is beautiful. I think she's probably the best character in the movie, in a movie packed with great characters. Every version of the character of the Merry Men is the best ever. Little John, Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet. They're all incredible characters. I love them all so much. And this has the best action, despite the fact that this is the oldest movie on the list. The best action sequences without question, because nothing is being faked. There's great stunt work, great sword fights. They shoot people with arrows, and it looks like they're actually shooting people with arrows because they're shooting people with arrows. There's no fakery in this movie. Like, they put padding on guys' chests, literally shot them, and that's how you get those sequences in the movie. It was a dangerous shoot by far, but it ends up being an incredible looking movie. And I think the sword fight, the climactic sword fight between Robin and Guy of Gisborne, is the best sword fight in any movie ever. I don't think it's ever been topped. There are great sword fights in The Princess Bride, in The Mask of Zorro, in the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, actually. And I don't think anything has topped this. The way that you see the shadows of them fighting against each other, the way that Robin pushes him off the stairway and Guy of Gisborne falls, and you see that entire stunt, and there's no trickery to it. It looks like a truly dangerous fight. They have great banter throughout it, great dialogue going on between them. It's one of my favorite action scenes in any movie ever. It's up with like Citizen Kane and Vertigo and such for one of the most perfect movies ever made. And that is The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938. It's amazing, and it's no question my number one. So that is my top 10 Robin Hood movies of all time. Let me know down in the comments what your top 10 Robin Hood movies are, or if you haven't quite seen 10, let me know what your favorites are, however many you want to name off. If you like videos like this, there are more top 10s and lots of other videos coming out very soon, so hit that subscribe, hit that like button. Thank you very much. I will see you next time.